This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
We welcome you to the second lesson in our survey of world religions. My name is Rod Rutherford. I'm your instructor for this course. As we begin this second study in our lessons on world religions, we want to review for just a moment to be reminded of some of the important facts that we learned in our last lesson. We learned in our last lesson that all men are religious by nature, that in all the civilizations that have been found in different places of the world, it has been found that men have always had some kind of religion. We also learned that religion separates man from the animal world. Man is not an evolved being, nor is man related to animals, but man is a separate creation, the highest creation of all, and in man God has placed an immortal spirit or soul. We also learned a very simple definition of religion. Religion is the binding of man back to God, or to gods, or to a set of sacred beliefs. We dealt with the subject or the question in our last lesson, why study world religions? Why study world religions? We pointed out that modern transportation and communication have actually shrunk the world in which we live, and therefore we're much more apt to come in contact with those who believe in other religions than ever before. We also pointed out that many of the world religions, which for a long time were dormant and non-aggressive, have now become very militant, and they are now seeking to convert Christians to their particular beliefs. And so we need to study world religions in order to be able to give an answer for our faith and to be able to contend for the faith. Then we need to study world religions, we pointed out, so that we can be prepared to preach the gospel to them. Jesus told us to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. That means that we must preach the gospel to Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and Shintoists and animists and Zoroastrians and all of these others, because they are creatures made in the image of God. And then finally we learned we needed to study world religions in order to understand the world in which we live and the motivation behind many of the events in the news. We concluded last study with looking at the fact that all religions are not the same. I pointed out to you that I'm a Christian. I believe completely in God, the God who created the universe, in His Son Jesus Christ, and in the Bible as God's inspired revelation to man. Because of that, I believe there's one God, there's one Savior, Jesus Christ, there's but one gospel, which is the power of God unto salvation. There's but one church, which is the Church of Jesus Christ. And there's but one plan of salvation. And that plan of salvation involves hearing the gospel, believing in Jesus Christ, repenting of one's sins, confessing one's faith in Christ, and then being buried with Christ in baptism in order to have one's sins washed away. And so these were the basic lessons that we learned in lesson number 1. Now as we continue our survey of world religions with lesson 2 today, we're going to look at the first part of a 3-part study on Islam. Islam, and this is entitled Islam, Surrender to Allah. Islam, Surrender to Allah. We're beginning our study with Islam because Islam is the closest in concept to Judaism and Christianity of any of the major religions of the world. It is very difficult for Western minds particularly to understand some of the concepts of Hinduism, but it is very easy for Western minds to understand Islam because Islam is closely related in many ways to Judaism and Christianity, and in fact, as we shall see, has borrowed heavily from both Christianity and Judaism. We're beginning also with Islam because Islam is the greatest rival of Christianity worldwide. Islam is growing very rapidly. It is not only growing rapidly in Africa and Asia, where it's growing at the rate of about 25 million members a year, but it's also growing in the United States, in Great Britain, and other countries in Western Europe. In Britain and France, for example, religious knowledge has long been a study in the public schools, a required study in many of the schools, and in the past that study has been mostly centered on Christianity and particularly a study of the Bible. But no longer, I understand, is this the case, because there are so many Muslims, particularly in Britain and in France. Now they are including a study of the Muslim religion in those religious knowledge classes. Not long ago, the Soviet Union fell. The empire that made up various communist nations, about 10 altogether, different republics that made up the Soviet Union, had posed a great threat. It was felt against the Western world. Now, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, that threat of communism has certainly waned. However, there will be future threats to war, probably, that may come from other sources. And some scholars and historians are saying that perhaps the greatest threat to world peace may in the future come from radical Muslim nations in the Middle East. We've already seen what radical fundamental Islam can do in the nation of Iran under the leadership of the late Ayatollah Khomeini. There was a great opposition, particularly to the Western world and to Christianity, and there was certainly a threat to world peace for a period of time. In the nation of Iraq, not long ago, many of the allied nations of Western Europe and other parts of the world fought a war against Iraq when they invaded their neighbor Kuwait. Under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, world peace was threatened by a Muslim nation. So we need to understand about Islam. We need to realize that we're going to have very close contact with it in the world in which we live. Now we must point out that Islam is the name of the religion. Islam is the name of the religion. Sometimes we talk about the Muslim religion, but actually the correct name is Islam. Islam means surrender to God. Islam means surrender to God. And the idea of Islam conveys to the mind of the Muslim an active surrender to a belief in one God who is called Allah, and to Muhammad, who is believed to be the prophet of Allah or the prophet of God. Further, we need to understand that followers of Islam are called Muslims, or sometimes Muslims. Followers of Islam are called Muslims, which means those who submit. Those who submit. And so Islam is the name of the religion, and those who hold it to that religion are called Muslims. Sometimes, I believe in India, they may be referred to as Muslimin or Muslims. But the word Mohammedan is not used as a rule by Muslims themselves. They prefer not to use it. In fact, they find it very offensive. Here in those of us who are members of the Church of Christ have sometimes been referred to as Campbellites. We're called Campbellites because Alexander Campbell was a well-known pioneer preacher in the early days of the Restoration movement in America. But we find that very offensive to be called a Campbellite because we're not followers of Alexander Campbell. We are followers of Jesus Christ. The Muslims look at their being called Mohammedans in the same way. They say, we're not followers of Muhammad. He was a man, though God's prophet, but we are those who follow Allah's true way. We submit to Allah, therefore we're to be called Muslims. I want to read to you now a quotation from the late Brother Andrew Connolly. Brother Connolly was a long-time missionary to the nations of Malawi and Tanzania, and East Africa. In Tanzania particularly, Islam is a very strong religion, and so Brother Connolly was well aware of the challenge that Islam presented to Christianity. Let's notice this quotation from Brother Andrew Connolly. He said, "Islam is a force to be reckoned with both politically and religiously in our world today. Unless Islam is stopped, millions will turn to her and her era. She is militant, aggressive, and evil. She cannot be ignored. She will not go away. She is strong and becoming stronger every day. We as Christians must meet every era known. Islam is worthy of our best efforts. We must learn her doctrines and meet her advocates. The Bible has the answer, and we must stand for the truth and oppose this great error." Now, I think Brother Connolly has stated very clearly why we need to be studying the religion called Islam. According to an article that appeared in a news magazine, the U.S. News and World Report, Islam is now the fastest growing religion in the United States of America. A sect that we have that is growing very rapidly is called the Nation of Islam, but there are also many immigrants coming in from Arabic nations and bringing their religion with them. A former student of mine told me of being in contact with a church in the state of Michigan in the northern United States. They wanted him to come and preach for them, a church of 100 members. They told him that they were having difficulty growing because their entire area was now inhabited by people of Arabic origin who all were Muslims, and they were having difficulty in reaching them with the gospel. But this illustrates, I think, the growth of Islam in America and other Western nations. It is now growing in the United States of America at the rate of 400% a year. Worldwide, Islam has about 1 billion adherents. About 1 billion adherents. It is adding 25 million members a year in Africa and Asia. Now, they're being added mostly by biological growth rather than conversion, but Islam is growing in those parts of the world. About 1/6 of the world's population is Muslim, that is, holds to the religion called Islam. The most Islamic nation in the world is the nation of Indonesia. Indonesia has within its borders more Muslims than any other country. It is followed in number of Muslims in the country by Pakistan and Bangladesh. We tend to think of the Middle East as being the center of the Muslim world, but that's not necessarily the case. We want to look at Islam now by beginning with a history of Islam. We will first study the history of Islam, and we will come to the name of a man that is essential to a knowledge of Islam, the name Muhammad. Muhammad. Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was born in Mecca in Arabia about 570 A.D. Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was born in Mecca in Arabia about 570 A.D. Now, the city of Mecca was an ancient city. It was commonly believed that the city of Mecca went back to the time of Abraham, about 2,000 years or so before Christ. In the city of Mecca there was a shrine or a temple, and this temple was called the Kaaba. The Kaaba was believed by Arabs to have been built by Abraham himself. Near there was a well, a spring called Zimzam. Now, the Arabs commonly believe that when Abraham, at the prodding of his wife Sarah, had sent his handmaid Hegar and her son Ishmael, his son by Hagar, Ishmael, away, that they had come to this place near Mecca, and when Hagar had despaired of their lives, she thought they were going to die for lack of water, and as the account is given in the book of Genesis, she left her son lying by a bush, and she went off some distance away. According to the Arab tradition, Ishmael, in his kicking and crying, had caused a spring of water to come up. Of course, God had blessed them with that, and they were therefore saved, and that spring of water had become the well Zimzam, and then the Kaaba had been built on the spot. Well, that sacred shrine to the Arabs was located in the city of Mecca, where Muhammad was born. Now, in the Kaaba was a black stone. This black stone is still there, and it was probably a meteorite that fell from the heavens, but it was regarded by the superstitious Arabs of ancient times as a gift from the gods. And so they enshrined it in the Kaaba, and they worshiped it. They held it in great reverence. The Kaaba also was a center of idol worship. The Arabs of Muhammad's day were polytheists, that is, they worshiped many gods as represented by idols. They were also animists in the belief that spirits were dwelling in trees and stones and rivers and so forth. And so they were wholly given to idolatry. When Muhammad was born, he was born without a father. His father had died just a few weeks before his birth. His mother died when he was only 6 years old, and so the boy was left as an orphan. But an uncle of his took him in and raised him as one of his own sons. Now, we understand from history that as a boy, Muhammad was not well. He was subject to having convulsions or fits. Probably those fits, according to medical authorities of today, were what we would call epileptic fits. But among a superstitious people, they were not understood in a medical sense. It's interesting when one studies the history of religions to observe how many religious leaders who later claimed to have visions given to them from God or the gods were subject to epileptic fits. When Muhammad was about 25 years of age, he became a camel driver, and he was employed by a wealthy widow whose name was Khadijah. Khadijah was so pleased with the work that Muhammad did on her behalf, and we're told that he was a handsome young man, that even though she was about 40 years of age and he was 25, she proposed marriage to him. Well, he gladly accepted her proposal of marriage. It seems they had a very happy marriage and that they truly loved one another. But now, being married to a wealthy widow, he had the leisure to pursue his greatest interest of all, and that was an interest in religion. He had long become disillusioned with idolatry and with the worship of the black stone in the Kaaba. He still believed in spirits and so forth, but he was gradually moving away from those primitive beliefs. He spent a month every year out in a cave in the desert in meditation, trying to find the true way. During the month of Ramadan, which was his month of meditation, he believed that he was visited by an angel. Now, he had come to believe in one God, and he had come to believe that the many idols that were worshipped by the Arabs was a false religion. He had not yet been able to convince anyone else of that belief, however. He probably learned his belief of the one God from either the Jews or the Christians. As a camel driver, he had opportunity to come in contact with both Jews and Christians, and there were colonies of both Jews and Christians living in Arabia. And from them and from their holy book, the Bible, no doubt he learned of the one true God. There are many things in the Islam religion that are similar to what we find in the Bible, and so we can easily see the influence of Judaism and Judaism and Christianity on Islam. But anyway, during the month of Ramadan, when Muhammad was about 40 years of age, he was out in the desert meditating in his cave, and he had what was to be the first of many visions, or at least what he considered to be many visions from God. The first vision came after he had had a period of meditation, and then he said the angel Gabriel appeared to him. The angel Gabriel gave him a writing and commanded him to read it. He protested. He said, "No, I can't read it. I do not know how to read." The angel handed it to him again and said, "Read it." Again he protested, "I cannot read." For the third time the angel gave it to him and told him to read, and said to him, "If God has commanded you to read, you must read." And he said he took it and read it. Now later Muslims tell us that Muhammad was illiterate, and they like to believe that he was illiterate because they say that he did not really write the Koran, but it was a result of revelations from God. But anyway, these visions continued from that time forward until the rest of his life. He would often go into a trance, and when he would speak in verse. Incidentally, it's known that in his earlier years he was very good at making up rhymes and poetry, and so this was a natural talent he seems to have had. But when he went into one of these trances, he would speak in verse form, and his followers would write it all down, and these writings then became the basis for the Koran. Well, one of his revelations, as just an example of what they were like, is the following. He was told to recite in the name of the Lord who created man from blood coagulated. Recite, the Lord is wondrous kind, who by the pen has taught mankind things they knew not, being blind. Well, you will find that verse and similar verses in the Koran. Now, in one of Muhammad's visions, he claims that he was taken at night on his horse from Mecca to the city of Jerusalem. You see, the Muslims hold the city of Jerusalem today to be a holy city, just as Jews and as some Christians do. But anyway, he claimed he was taken on his horse at night in the spirit, or bodily perhaps by means of the spirit, to Jerusalem. And from where the ancient temple had been built, from the Temple Mount, from that site, he and his horse were taken bodily up into heaven. They ascended to heaven, or to paradise. He came to a place where there was a stone, he said, and he tied his horse to a stone, and he saw a set of stairs. And he began to climb those stairs, and he arrived in the first heaven. In the first heaven he was greeted by Adam, the first man that God had created. And as he looked around in that first heaven, he related that he saw all the stars hanging on silver chains. Then from there he ascended another flight of stairs and went up to the second heaven. And in the second heaven he met the man Noah, the righteous man who was saved alive with his family when the rest of the world was destroyed in the great flood. He related that the second heaven was made of pure gold. Then he ascended another flight of stairs and came to the third heaven. Here in the third heaven he was greeted by Abraham, who of course is the father of the Arabic people through Ishmael, just as he's the father of the Hebrew people through his son Isaac. He said Abraham was an unusually large man. He was so large that the distance between his eyes was a journey of 70,000 days. Now friends, that's a pretty big man, isn't it? I don't know how he was able to see that far, to see from one eyeball to another, but we assume that miraculously, according to their teaching, he was able to do that. Well, he ascended still another flight of stairs and came to the fourth heaven. Here he met the righteous man Noah of Old Testament fame, and then he was taken to another flight of stairs where he ascended to the fifth heaven. He met Moses, the great lawgiver, and then he came to the sixth heaven where he met John the Baptist, who prepared the way for the coming of Jesus. Finally, he arrived at the top, the seventh heaven, and there he met Jesus, and he was taken within 2 bow shots of the throne of God, so he said. He had an interview with God, and in that interview with God, God told Muhammad that he was the greatest man on earth. And then Muhammad was taken back to the place where his horse was tied. He came back to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem miraculously was taken back to Mecca, all in the same night. Now this, of course, is believed by Muslims, and it is a foundation of much of their religious teaching. We'll see that the people that Muhammad said he met in heaven are people who are held to be prophets by the Muslims. Well, Muhammad began preaching his new religion, but he was not a very successful preacher. Very few people would pay any attention to him. His wife Khadijah believed him. In fact, Muhammad himself had some doubts about his visions. He thought that maybe he was being deceived by evil spirits. And it was Khadijah who persuaded him that he had actually received a revelation from a true angel of the true God. And so she became a believer in him, and then later other family members came to believe in him, and from there his faith spread to the poorer classes of Mecca. Particularly slaves accepted the new faith, but the faith did not go beyond that until a wealthy man by the name of Abu Bakr, a very wealthy merchant, became a believer. And once he became a believer, it became respectable to accept the new religion, and so others then became converts to the new Islamic faith. Because of his opposition to idolatry, and idolatry, you remember, was widely practiced in Mecca, with the Kaaba being located there. But because of his opposition to idolatry, Muhammad and his followers were persecuted. Now, they persecuted his followers more than they persecuted him, because he had the protection of his clan and also the protection of this wealthy merchant. But eventually the persecution became so severe that he was forced to leave Mecca and go to a neighboring city called Yathrib. Now later Yathrib was renamed Medina, and Medina means city of the prophet. Some historians believe that Muhammad had already been in contact with the Jews in Yathrib. There was a large colony of Jews living there, and the Jews were persecuted by the Arabs because they only believed in one true God. And when they found out that Muhammad believed in one true God, they may have thought that he was an ally. And so they were willing to welcome him into Yathrib. On the night of July the 16th, in the year 622, Muhammad's flight took place from Mecca to Medina. Muhammad's flight on July the 16th in 622 is called the Hegira, and this marks the beginning of the Muslim calendar. He left the city of Mecca and went to Medina, where he was welcomed with open arms. Now at first the Jews accepted him and made his coming very easy and very comfortable, but after a while they found out that even though he believed in one God as they did, that he believed his faith was the only true faith and that Judaism was a false religion. And so they turned against Muhammad. And when they turned against them, he had them killed, and he forbade his followers to pray toward Jerusalem. Before this, they had always prayed bowing in the direction of Jerusalem. Now he taught them to pray bowing toward Mecca. And followers of Muhammad to this very day pray in that way. Muhammad gathered an army, and he began to conquer the tribes round about Medina and Mecca. He finally conquered Mecca again, and over the next 20 years warfare went on until Muhammad and his followers had conquered all of the Arabian Peninsula. This was the first time in history that these wild Bedouin tribes that lived in Arabia were all under one leadership. Now Muhammad died in the year 632. By that time he had completed the conquest of Arabia, and the land was all being ruled by an Islamic government. Muhammad's death was a mysterious death. There are some Muslim traditions that say that he was poisoned, and they say that the woman who poisoned him was found out, apprehended, and brought to him, but that in his dying moments he forgave her. Now it is very likely that he was poisoned. Whether or not they found the poisoner and whether or not he forgave her cannot be really known for sure. The Muslim religion at this time, Islam, had become a very militant religion. They had been so successful in conquering all of Arabia that they continued their wars of conquest, and they spread their faith by the sword. As they conquered new territories, occasionally leniency would be shown to the people there, and they might be allowed to practice their religion but not try to convert others. But in many cases they were forced to convert to Islam at the point of a sword. Within a century of Muhammad's death, Muslims had conquered all the Middle East and North Africa. Eventually they also conquered Spain, Turkey, India, and part of China. And then Arab traders, in traveling around the world, brought the Muslim religion to Indonesia and to the Philippines and to Southeast Asia. And so the Muslim religion actually made a belt around all the earth. It spread right around the world. The Muslims continued their conquest by the sword. They crossed over from North Africa and conquered Spain and Portugal, and then they were making their way on into Europe. But finally their advance was stopped by Charles Martel, the King of France, at the Battle of Tours in 732. The Battle of Tours in 732, Charles Martel and the French army soundly defeated the Muslim forces and sent them back into Europe. After centuries of fighting, finally they were driven out of Spain and Portugal and back across the Mediterranean into North Africa. That Battle of Tours is regarded as one of the most decisive battles in world history. Had the Muslims been successful, then they probably would have conquered all of Western Europe. Christianity would have been largely wiped out, and the history of the Western world, certainly, and maybe of the whole world, would have been greatly altered. We want to look now at the major divisions of Islam. The major divisions of Islam. Sometimes we have a tendency to think of Islam as one great uniform religion. We have a tendency to think that all those who are Muslims believe exactly the same thing, but that's not true. There are many different factions, literally thousands of them, within Islam, just as there are within the broad general heading of Christianity. But the three major divisions are divisions that we want to notice. But let's see how they came about. Following Muhammad's death, there was a great struggle for the control of the new religion. Many of the tribes in Arabia who had been conquered began to rebel and to pull away. They had an allegiance to Muhammad, but now that he was dead, they didn't consider that allegiance to be binding anymore, and so something had to be done. There was a great struggle for leadership of the new faith. Finally, Muhammad's friend and early convert, Abu Bakr, was chosen as leader, but he was able to continue only for 2 years. He was murdered by a fellow Muslim, and following that then, Islam split into 3 major divisions, and as we've already said, each of these divisions subdivided into many smaller groups. The largest of all these divisions are the Sunnis. The Sunnis. The Sunnis took their name from the word Sunni, which refers to practice, the practice of Muhammad. Now the Muslims have a holy book called the Quran, which guides them in what they believe and what they practice. But as Islam spread around the world, new situations arose for which they could find no precedent in the Quran. And so in order to know how to deal with these problems, they looked to Muhammad's example, to things in his life, to see what they might find that would help them. And so they became known as Sunnis, those who looked to the practice of Muhammad. The Sunni division of Islam is the largest of all the divisions. There are more Muslims who belong to the Sunni division than any other. Now generally the Sunnis are not as radical as the other groups among the Muslims. They have a much more tolerant attitude to those of other religious beliefs. A second major group of the Muslims are the Shiites. The Shiites. The Shiites take their name from the Arabic word meaning party or faction. Party or faction. And they began in this way. There was a man by the name of Ali. Ali was the son-in-law of Muhammad. He had married Muhammad's only surviving child, whose name was Fatima. Now Muhammad had several children, several sons by Khadijah and other wives that he later took, but all these sons had died in infancy, and his daughter Fatima was the only child that survived his death. Well, Ali was married to Fatima. He was chosen as a leader of the Shiites. He and his two sons, however, were murdered by other Muslims, and that probably had an effect on the future history of the Shiites and made them more radical than others. The Shiites are the most radical and militant of all Muslims. The Shiites are the most radical and militant of all Muslims. Today, when we hear of Muslim fundamentalists who are guilty of some act of terrorism, in most cases they belong to the Shiite division of Islam. The Shiites today control Iran. The late Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran was a leader among the Shiites, and they claim that they are the only true followers of Muhammad today. And then the third major group among the Muslims are the Sufis. The Sufis are the mystics of Islam. The Sufis are the mystics of Islam. They oppose the rigid interpretation of the Quran of the Shiites, and they seek a personal experience with Allah. They are very emotional in what they do. We sometimes hear of the whirling dervishes. They are Sufis who are, by their means of their whirling, are trying to get in touch with Allah or with God. Now, in summing up this second lesson in our study today, we want to remind you that Islam presents the only serious competition to Christianity of the major religions of the world today. We want to remind you that Islam is growing very rapidly on every continent. It's especially growing rapidly in Africa and Asia, but it's also growing in the Western world. We need to understand that as Christians we must be prepared to preach the gospel to Muslims, and we must also be prepared to defend the truth of the gospel when challenged by Muslims. In our next two lessons, we will continue our study of Islam. We will look at some of the major teachings of Islam, and we will contrast them with the Word of God.
This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.